All right, just a little bit about me and my background. I'm excited to be here and understanding it's a small crew that's attending this. I'm happy to make this super conversational, but a little bit more about me. Um, on the left side of the screen, you see a little bit of a blurry document there. That's a birth certificate from way back in the day, and that's my birth certificate. When I was born, my parents were told by the doctors to not name me. I was born 3 months premature, and I only weighed 2.5 pounds. So I was super tiny and really too early to be born. Um, my parents said, you know what, we're going to name him. We're going to give him the strongest name we can. So they named me Joshua Bernard Zachary Loebner. So I'm a four-namer. And that's where my disability journey started. I was born fully blind in my left eye, and I'm legally blind in my right eye. So everything's super blurry, but that is okay because that's how I've always seen. Just a little bit more about me. I'm so glad to be part of the AEF and to speak to students all across the country, and glad to have this conversation today. And on this side of the screen, you see a little bit of the different projects that I'm a part of, and hopefully through all of those, I can share a conversation about welcoming disability into the industry. I also have a podcast. I really enjoy traveling and have been so disappointed that travel hasn't been a part of almost anybody's journey, but we're starting to hopefully move into that. I have a podcast that I co-host along with another blind gentleman. He is Toby Willis. He's with the Expedia Group, and we talk to different brands all across the country about ways to be able to welcome disability into marketing, into travel and tourism. Along with supporting the AEF, there are a number of different organizations within advertising at the industry level that I really feel glad to be a part of and welcome conversations. The Adweek DEI Council, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, it comprises some of the most big brands you could ever think of. And it's not just the brands that are a part of it. These people who are part of the DEI Council are really committed. They're CMOs, brand executives, brand directors, COOs, chief executive officers even. And every one of them is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the thing that I like to share with students is, no matter the path within advertising you're interested in moving into, or whatever career you're moving into, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really not something anymore that's on the periphery, but major executives and major brands are making commitments towards DE&I, which is powerful and positive. I do want to say Black Lives Matter before I dive into conversations about more specifically disability in the DE&I space and how that connects to advertising and branding. George Floyd, of course, 2 summers ago really was in the news for so many negative reasons, and that halo in this mural that's developed here on this slide shows all the other people who are people of color who either were killed or in some way, shape, or form were negatively connected to some challenges that have happened all across the country. And that's significant. And George Floyd's name, of course, still is in the news, and it's impactful. And it's impactful from a branding perspective, right? We've seen brands really that have been monuments have been toppled, whether it's a very familiar household name like Aunt Jemima, changing to Pearl Milling Company, NASCAR eliminating the Confederate flag at races, the Chiefs changing their name, Mississippi changing its flag, thank goodness, and so many other brands reframing themselves. But what does that mean about disability? And how does that connect back to you as students moving into whatever career you're moving into? Well, disability affects all of us. An interesting consideration about disability is that it impacts millions of people in our country, and globally it impacts 1 billion people. I'm out of Tennessee, and just to share, this map shows that there are more people per capita with disabilities in the Southeast. So that's a pretty significant statement. The other thing to know is that for a lot of students, disability really doesn't connect with, may not connect with them. But it's open 24/7. It is one of the few minority groups that anybody at any time could be a part of. And as we all age, disability is something that will connect with us. And it's something that you may not be disabled, but your parents might, or your grandparents, or other people connected to you, or your spouse. So disability really does impact everyone. 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. The consideration here, though, is that from a media perspective, there are so few people with disabilities broadly in mass communications, media and entertainment, um, in advertising in particular, that it just seems like it's really a niche, small audience. But in fact, it's not. It's huge. And so because of that, myself and others that are advocating for greater disability inclusion feel like this is a wonderful time. And of course, we did see some of that with Crip Camp recently being nominated for one of the best documentaries of this past year at the Oscars. And while they didn't win, it still elevated disability to a higher level, which is wonderful. Advertising doesn't just promote features and benefits. It really does shape identity, and not identity simply of us as individuals, but as well, it identifies us as a society. And it helps to create a reality. And that's a bit metaphysical maybe, but what I would suggest is that that reality that you have of those brands that you love, of those brands that you really don't even know about or don't care about, that shapes your reality, whether it's, the apparel that you purchase, the car that you drive, where you live, what universities you attend. Advertising can play a significant role in so many facets of your life. And the other interesting thing about advertising is that sometimes it's kind of pushed aside and not seen as maybe as important as a feature film or as literature. But what I would say is that advertising powers every single other media. If it wasn't for the dollars and the commitments that brands make to be able to showcase the opportunity for a tentpole movie coming up in the summer through advertising that's seen in so many other places, or any other media, New York Times bestseller that comes out, how to be able to promote that. It's all through advertising. So advertising really is powerful. But again, it goes beyond features and benefits to really shaping our reality, whether that's a reality from an ableist perspective, and ableism is looking down at disability, or more of a welcoming perspective. Just to kind of give a little bit of history about disability, for so long, and why it seems like it's othered or not a part of society. We've heard that disability doesn't belong in public. Years and years ago, about 120 years ago, right at the turn of the last century, there were laws that were on the books across municipalities all across the country that suggested if somebody with a disability came out into the public, they could be fined, they could be arrested. And so people with disabilities were put in basements, were put in back rooms, were institutionalized outside of and away from the general public. So there had persisted this perception of, well, there's not a lot of people with disabilities, but there always have been. They've just been not welcomed. And this significantly, and I hate to share this slide, points it out. And this is the ghost of the past, World War II, where in Nazi Germany, people with disabilities really were the test subjects for the larger Holocaust, horrifically. And this poster points the fact out that, at least from the perception of normative society in Germany, that people with disabilities were costing the communities thousands of dollars, when in fact the Germans had a different solution to eliminate those costs. Horrific. The ghosts of the past rear themselves back up, and I hate to say this, in my home state, I will say more than likely in others as well. This poster here that says "Sacrifice the Weak," Open TN, was at one of the protests at the start of COVID, when the states started to move into locking people down, and we were all social distancing extremely and self-isolating. And that's a powerful consideration. Two different posters, all still that there are people that believe that those with disabilities could be sacrificed. The one thing also to note is that we've seen protest after protest, and I appreciate and support so many protests that we've seen for Black Lives Matter, and for others, other minorities, to stop Asian hate, for example. Those protests are powerful. I share all these slides with you to recognize that disability isn't just a passive kind of quiet audience. The largest and longest protest that occurred in a federal building happened in 1977 when people with disabilities occupied a federal building for more than 30 days to protest the inequality and inaccessibility that was happening at that time. So people with disabilities do want to be vocal and do want to be able to suggest that, hey, there's a place for them in society, and sometimes society doesn't see that, but they should. Again, at the onset of COVID, as a contributing writer for Adweek, I wanted to see what was going on with the disability community when it came to advertising. And what I noticed was that brands were trying to, in some way, convey that they were there when we were all isolating in our homes and sheltering in place and social distancing. And so brands tried to incorporate ways to weave in DE&I broadly. They showed everything from queer couples celebrating wine and dining at home, or mixed race couples, which is wonderful. But what was missing was disability. And the strange and disappointing note there is that a lot of the social distancing, a lot of the lockdown where we all were in our homes or apartments for so long was because we didn't want to pass COVID on to those people who were immunocompromised, a lot of which were in the disability community. So it was interesting that brands didn't really understand that connection, or if they did, they didn't convey it in a way that showed that they supported the disability community at such a critical time. So this past year has been phenomenal, though, from a positive when it came to the Americans with Disabilities Act. We celebrated the 30th anniversary of it, and the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991 really was a watershed legislation that opened doors and pathways for greater inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities. This image, though, shows it wasn't just a kind of a glad handing and people patting themselves on the back and saying, yes, we're going to welcome disability as congressmen and legislators and politicians. People with disabilities, this is called the Capitol Hill Crawl, where people with disabilities who had mobility disabilities turned their wheelchairs sideways and literally they couldn't walk. They used their arms to crawl up the steps of Capitol Hill so that legislators would notice them. And we appreciate everything that they did. We understand and celebrate the 30th anniversary, but we know that there's still some ways to go when it comes to acceptance and inclusion of people with disabilities, especially in advertising. That said, there have been phenomenal strides in advertising, and disability doesn't just support disability from a medical standpoint, right? We're seeing disability included in underwear ads, in candy ads, in accessible apparel, so many different ways, and also welcoming invisible disabilities, which could be those people who are neurodiverse, who have autism or other intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's not just showing that person in a wheelchair and checking a box. So I don't want to say that advertising hasn't made progress. There are so many phenomenal campaigns that have come about recently. I'm going to show you one right now, and I hope the audio comes through. Let me go back and see. Let's see. Well, my commercials are not playing, and I don't know why. So I'll just describe, well, here's the degree when it's playing now.
People say that you have to choose your battles. I say that sometimes the battle chooses you. The battle against being told you can't do. Your doubts, your fears. The battle against the limits, your own, and those that others impose. You have to fight them all. even when you feel like you can't. You have to fight them all. Degrees created the world's first adaptive deodorant filled with a diverse disability community. Because there should be no limits when something moves us.
So that was a great commercial. That was actually developed and launched just in the past few months. And the amazing thing about that commercial and that campaign, the Degree deodorant, is it's not just a kind of a thin recognition of disability, but you saw the packaging for that deodorant was totally reimagined to be able to allow for people who might have mobility disabilities or ambulatory disabilities, such that their arms weren't allowing them to have full dexterity. There were different elements within that package, whether it's the magnetic cap, the hook on the top, the holes in the bottom of that, or the reusable insert of deodorant to be able to allow virtually anyone to more easily feel fresh every day, which is pretty important. And what makes it great is that really end to end, the brand, the agency took a deeper perspective of how to welcome disability to the table. Christina Milan worked on that. She's with Wonderman Thompson. And if you want to find out more about her, you can read the latest issue of Advertising and Society Quarterly, just to plug there, and I'm in there as well. So that's a great campaign. Super excited about that. Let me see if I can get this Google ad to play.
I'm what's called a coda. My parents were both born deaf. I was not. When people in the hearing world learn that about me, they always want to know more.
Start out your forehead and then go out with your hand.
I've always had one foot in the deaf world and one in the hearing world. I translated a lot for my parents. It made us closer. Now that it's been over a year since we've seen each other in person, communication is more important than ever, especially with this guy. It's their first time being grandparents, so they don't want to miss a single moment. And I don't either. We can't wait for you to meet him.
So that's a super awesome commercial as well. And the great thing about that commercial, again, just like the Degree commercial, is that Google didn't just insert somebody with a disability, but look deeper into how their product could better integrate with disability. Just a second plug, K.R. Liu is the brand accessibility director there at Google, and she's also part of a panel conversation in Advertising and Society Quarterly. So the AEF are just taking the lead when it comes to connecting disability inclusion into advertising and really teasing out opportunities on how everyone from faculty to students could welcome those conversations. To keep this conversation going, though, from a creative standpoint, there are different representations of disability that could be positive or negative. And this pendulum here shows what could be positive is really just inclusion. But outside of that one where the pendulum is in the middle are extremes. And on both sides, there could be negatives of erasure, where a brand just kind of throws their hands up and says, you know, we don't know what to do, so we're not going to do anything. Or at the other extreme, pity, where people with disabilities are seen as lesser than people who are abled. And then in between all of those, there are different ones that I'll speak to in a little bit, but othering is pretty straightforward. Infantilism is seeing somebody with a disability as childlike, which is not a good thing. Supercrip, it's pretty self-explanatory, seeing people with disabilities as athletes only and nothing else. And I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but I do want to pause. Are there any questions right now before I continue the conversation?
Any questions?
And if not, that's okay.
That's okay. That's right.
All right, so I'm going to dive into some of these terms a little bit more. On
Yeah.
one side of the screen that has a white background and colored letters, those are really what we don't want when it comes to disability inclusion. And on the right side are the words that should resonate and are positive. Now, everybody has their own interpretation of disability, and so certain individuals may feel like those words do relate and resonate with them. But for the most part, these words on the left, handicap, cripple, handicapable, differently abled, special needs, and invalid, or invalid, right, if you pronounce it differently, are ones that people with disabilities are not, for the most part, comfortable with. We really do welcome disability. You know, if you think about the Pride movement with the LGBTQ plus community, they have a whole month dedicated to Pride, and that is amazing and wonderful. And the thing that I would say about disability is that, you know, I wake up every day, I'm still blind, and I'm proud to be in advertising. I'm proud to be a dad. I'm proud to connect with you as students today, and I'm proud of my disability. It doesn't make me any lesser than or more than anyone else. There's a medical model of disability and there's a social model. The medical model is one that frames disability only from a physical and scientific or biological scientific standpoint, that, well, it breaks down disability simply by I'm missing an eye and I'm legally blind in another eye, but that doesn't connect culturally in any way. It just connects back to me as an individual and not societally. The same could be said for any other minority or majority for that standpoint. We don't just consider people of color by the melatonin and the color of their skin, right? There's a cultural component, both positive and negative, of being Black in America and what that means, because there's a societal and cultural connectivity therein. And when I say negative, I'm in no way suggesting that it's negative to be a Black person. There are so many positives associated with it. What I mean are the negative overtones sometimes that society imparts on them. The same is true for sexuality and gender, right? We could look at it specifically from a medical model standpoint, but we don't, right? Women come together culturally and societally. People of color come together culturally and societally. And there are positives and negatives on both sides, but people with disabilities want to be part of that society and not just be seen as from a healthcare model standpoint. One-dimensional versus intersectionality. You know, I'm not a prop. People with disabilities don't want to be props in an ad, but rather welcomed intersectionality wise, in that intersectionality basically means layered elements of an individual. Now that could mean a Black woman who's queer, who's in a wheelchair, right? So those are multiple minorities layered one onto the other. And those things should be considered in any type of communication. Ableism versus equity. Ableism really is looking down on people with disabilities as second-class citizens. We all know about racism. We all know about sexism. Ableism is the other negative ism that should be identified. Equity is really looking at a community and trying to, in some way, shape, or form, be able to elevate individuals and groups in a way that puts them at a similar level to others. And that kind of connects back to allyship versus inspiration porn. So inspiration porn is, for example, somebody watching a social media video that shows a person who's blind playing the piano, and the person who's watching it is non-disabled, and thousands of people watch it and thousands of people say that they are inspired by it, but it's an empty inspiration. It's a vacant inspiration where they don't do anything else watching video and potentially feel better about themselves because they're not disabled. Whereas allyship is really hopefully walking or moving arm in arm down a path towards progress with people with disabilities, so that the non-disabled and the able can collaborate, whether it's on creative campaigns, whether it's on, it doesn't matter. Students and faculty can collaborate and hopefully move down a path of progress. Infantilism, I brought that up earlier, really is looking at people with disabilities, and a couple of examples are for, one might be a little person who's an adult might be patted on the head and seen as cute from a childlike perspective when that shouldn't be the case, or treated like a child, or somebody in a wheelchair that's patted on the head. Just because they are smaller than potentially people standing up doesn't mean that they need to be treated like an infant. A lot of people with disabilities are fine with adulting, drinking beer. This is a screenshot from the Maltesers commercial where the young lady is talking about a sexual relationship she has with her boyfriend, and she has a disability and is in a wheelchair, and it's okay to talk about that. This was, I think, one of the first times in an advertisement that somebody with a disability brought up sex, and that's okay. And so disability doesn't need to be seen as this thing that's infantile, but rather just a part of normal society. Supercrip versus social normalization. Supercrip looks at disability, and oftentimes in the past, this has happened with other minorities, in particular people of color, in advertising, where in the 1950s, prior to the civil rights movement, when people of color were starting to be introduced into advertising, sometimes they would only be in an ad based on the fact that they were an athlete. And that has positives, but that also has negatives. That is not the only vocation of people of color, right? That people of color can do certain things and sometimes they can't. And the same is true for people with disabilities. We've got the Paralympics coming up. And that is not the only time a brand needs to be able to celebrate disability inclusion or simply focus on Paralympians. I am definitely not a Paralympian, right? And so a lot of the people in advertising who are featured that have disabilities don't simply have to be Paralympians. After the Paralympics, hopefully brands recognize the fact that it's not just this one time to push people with disabilities onto the screens. And there have been a lot of cases that this hasn't happened, but that's just a point of fact to note. We just want to be normal. This shot here behind social normalization was from an Apple commercial to promote voice control. The man in the commercial cannot move his body below his neck, and yet he's traveled to over 600 micro distilleries and microbreweries across the West Coast and sampled way more beers probably than I have, which is awesome. Disability friendly versus disability facts. So we really don't want this ambiguity of, hey, we're a disability friendly brand, but what does that mean? And you can look back to that Degree example or the Google example where they really create products that welcome disability inclusion, whether it's the live captioning that Google offered or this innovative packaging of a deodorant. And the same is true when it comes to everything from ride shares to hotels to restaurants to a university campus, right? What are some disability facts that, let's say, a university could share on its website that conveys the accessibility of all of the spaces and places that make up that campus and the different buildings on that campus? So that's an opportunity for brands to really look at a high level. Commercials, of course, always need to be emotive, and an ad campaign needs to in some way tell a narrative story arc. But then once we get more granular with the communications, how can it be much more factual to open up the conversation even in more detail? Second class versus citizen, this is pretty self-explanatory. Hopefully we're all the same level from a citizenship standpoint. This is a still shot from a commercial that was created in the summer of 2020 where individuals, Black people, were showcasing how, if they were deaf or hard of hearing, they could convey Black Lives Matter, which was wonderful and phenomenal. So this was a way that suggested it doesn't matter what community people of color are in, whether they're in the deaf community, whether they're in a spoken word community, everybody should be able to be behind the Black Matter. So this last term here, virtue signaling, is one that is a negative. We do not want virtue signaling, and virtue signaling sometimes pops up at these different times in the year when brands try to celebrate minorities. And I can think of an example, to celebrate Pride Month, the LGBTQ plus community, right? Brands sometimes change their social media icons to rainbow overlays, where they in some way try to welcome people in that community. But the challenge is that if that's the only thing they do, then they're only doing a thin veneer of what could be better welcoming to the LGBTQ plus community through internships, through hiring more people in that community, through creating packaging like Skittles did, and like Doritos did in a very small way, where rainbow colors were incorporated to be able to celebrate Pride, but also to give back to certain initiatives. And so with the disability community, just for example, again, going back to that prop example, don't look at us as simply a token representation of disability by putting somebody in a wheelchair in an ad campaign. How can you unpack that more to move beyond virtue signaling to have a deeper commitment? And so here are some considerations to do that. This diagram shows two different elements of advertising, very simplified. On the right side is advertising consumption, right? That's what we all do whenever we open our mobile device and see an ad on our mobile phone, or a pre-roll on YouTube, or a print magazine ad, or anything else, television ad. That's advertising consumption. But of course, before advertising consumption, there's advertising creation. And whether it's in the creative brief, or the creative team, or the production, or campaign development, all of those areas present wonderful opportunities to welcome not only DE&I conversations, but disability conversations, to suggest how disability could be really better tapped into the commitments by individuals and organizations. And the title slide of this presentation is CRIP Theory and Creative Briefs. CRIP is a term that at one time was seen as a pejorative. It's kind of anachronistic. It's something that was given to people with disabilities by people who didn't have disabilities. But there are certain people in the disability community who are welcoming the term CRIP as a word that connects back to more of a societal interpretation of disability as opposed to that disability model. And so my suggestion here, and in my dissertation research work, and in my daily life as a practitioner in advertising, is to somehow welcome more upstream the conversation about disability within the creative process. And so here, this takes it back even further to your level as students. How can disability be better brought in, whether it's recruiting more students with disabilities into advertising? Because I was not recruited. I have a long story about how I didn't start in advertising. I was in forestry. I got an undergraduate in forestry resource management, and that was not very good for me as a blind person. Advertising, perfect for me. I like to talk a lot too, so it's a great opportunity for me in so many ways. And I would suggest also for so many other disabled students, but a lot of them don't know about advertising as a career path. So recruiting more students, making sure that conversations like this can happen, whether it's through the AEF MADE initiatives here that we're just starting out with this summer, or whether it's internships, or whether it's faculty with disabilities, or a faculty who's non-disabled, incorporating broadly DE&I conversations and disability and accessibility and inclusion into their lectures, to be able to hopefully guide everyone. And then skill sets that you as students can be able to train, be able to learn, so that if you want to develop a website, it could be accessible. If you want to create an ad campaign, you know how to hopefully better welcome disability into the topics. And so I like to reframe conversations in a way that make them pretty simple. I'm a fan of disabled ideas. I'm a fan of Black ideas. I'm a fan of Latinx ideas. One is neither better than the other or less than the other. All of those can hopefully make good ideas. And right now there's kind of a jumble of acronyms where some industries talk about DE&I, some industries talk about EDI. I like to talk about ideas, and my acronym stands for inclusive, diverse, equitable, accessible successes, so that we can have measurable ways to be able to incrementally move the conversation forward when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as well accessibility for the disability community. And that accessibility is not the only consideration when welcoming disability, but that it also connects back to inclusion and diversity and so many other things. Just to wrap things up, I didn't come up with this, but just to share this from another disability advocate. Accessibility is being able to get into a building. Diversity is getting invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table. And belonging is having your voice heard at the table. So that's really what we want is I, as a disabled person, want to belong personally. I want to belong professionally. And hopefully you'll see as the Advertising Education Foundation has done, they're helping people with disabilities to be able to have more of a voice. So thank you so much to the AEF. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Josh. You're getting a couple of claps here, which is wonderful. And Rimsha had a comment about your ideas acronym. She said she loved it. So all good feedback. Questions, guys, if you want to come off mute, just raise your hand and I can get you off mute and you can ask your question directly, or you can ask it in the chat and I'll read it out.
You know, I actually can start off with the questions because I have one, Josh.
Sure.
I've heard different things in terms of how you describe people with disabilities, in terms of, you know, calling them first people and then
Right.
describing the disability, or, you know, calling someone, you know, a disabled person.
Right.
I've heard both sides to that. Can you talk a little bit about what, you know, is acceptable and what, you know, we think we'll see in the future there?
So it's interesting. That definitely is I don't want to say a hot topic, but it's something that certain people in the disability community are very adamantly passionate about, whether it's identity first or person first. And identity first would be, I'm a blind advertising professional. Person first, I'm a professional in advertising that's blind, right? So which which matters? Language is important, right? So even something that seems like it shouldn't be really important for a lot of people in the disability community, it is. Now, globally, in other countries, for example, in the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth countries, it is identity first. Disabled people is what is the typical terminology there, and the terminology that's used in advertising agencies and in creative campaigns. Here in America, for the most part, it's people with disabilities, the acronym for that, PWDs. And there is within the University of Arizona, the Walter Cronkite Communications Department has the, what is it? It is the National Journalism and Disability, National Center on Disability and Journalism, and they produced a disability style guide that has been really accepted by major media outlets, including the New York Times, and they advocate for person first, so people with disabilities. But that said, it really comes down to who you're working with on a campaign and what their passion is and what they feel like is important. So we might see certain brands coming out with identity first versus person first. It just depends on the individual right now.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I actually have a question myself. So the spectrum of disability, of course, is very wide and there are varying levels of it. So when a brand wants to incorporate disability into their advertising or their product line, how do they go about deciding what to focus on?
That's a great question. And there are some fundamental elements to focus on, and accessibility really is that fundamental element before you get to story narrative. So all communications needs to in some way connect. And if it can't connect in a certain way, how can it be more accessible? So for example, for videos, can there be an audio description associated with it? And an audio description uses an off-camera narrator to be able to share what's taking place in a scene. And that's outside and a part of a voiceover or somebody directly on camera like me right now talking. And so audio descriptions are now being incorporated into a number of different commercials. The Google commercial, the Degree commercial have separate audio described versions that can be accessed. And then also lower third at the bottom of the screen of whatever I'm saying being written out at the bottom. So those are certain things. If it's primarily an audio campaign, are there transcripts written transcripts or textual transcripts for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to be able to easily access what's being shared, for example, in a podcast. And so accessibility is important. And then, of course, accessibility digitally. Is a brand's website accessible? Thinking from an omnichannel perspective, are there other digital communications, their social media, their paid advertisements, are those accessible? But then, Sarah, to kind of anchor into that question even more within the story arc, what can one do to make sure that they're inclusive and welcoming people with disabilities? And that's where research comes in. That's where a brand can reach out to their consumers to be able to hear stories, maybe get testimonials of a variety of different community groups, different disabilities, to hear from them and see how those can fit into a campaign. And lots of times people ask the question, well, how can invisible disabilities, or those disabilities that are not physically obvious, be able to be welcomed into a campaign? And what I like to share is that you might see somebody in a commercial that has autism, but you might not readily know it, but that an advertising campaign is much more than a 30-second commercial. There's a website that has dozens, if not hundreds of pages that they could dedicate to a small snippet of that, to a behind-the-scenes narrative conversation about the actor or the talent. Or there could be a behind-the-scenes video that walks through that actor or that talent that has autism and what that means. So it really is hearing from consumers, constituents, and individuals on the creative team, hopefully that either all have disabilities or that are a part of allyship, that can be able to build into that larger narrative and welcome disability in hopefully a bold way.
Great, thank you. Okay, does anyone else have questions? I know Haley had to hop out, but she said she learned a lot today, and thanks you, Josh. Oh, Elizabeth has one. Awesome. Okay, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much, Josh, for this talk. I was taking notes. I learned so much. I know you talked a little bit about how the pandemic has influenced disability representation and advertising in terms of not being represented in pandemic marketing. I was wondering what other impacts have you seen in terms of moving all virtually onto stuff like this? I know that Zoom has closed captioning capabilities, but sometimes it's not very good, or so I just wanted your take on that. Just working in a professional environment and how that relates to disability inclusion post-pandemic.
Yeah, so that's a great question. For certain people with disabilities, this has been phenomenal. So for so long, people with disabilities that might have had challenges when it comes to physically working in an office, whether it's, so I don't drive, so whether it's commuting to an office or in some other way working in an office, if that was a challenge, they would advocate, and this is pre-pandemic, these individuals would advocate for working remotely. And for so many corporations, that was seen as something that they wouldn't allow. But of course, the pandemic fundamentally changed everything, where so many of us, if not all of us, are working remotely, right? And so for those people with disabilities that were seeing challenges in the past, this opened the floodgate for them to be able to more easily connect. What I will say is there have been certain conversations amongst little people, for example, where they felt like they've been empowered by Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whichever platform, video platform, because they've been seen literally at the same level as everyone else that's in the meeting. And so wherein, for example, going back to infantilism, a little person in a boardroom that physically can't be as tall as other people might be seen as lesser than. They might not have felt like they belonged at the table because of their disability. Whereas here, this does create an equity amongst everyone to be able to hopefully speak openly. So there are certain people in the disability community that love this, and I love it as well. So the pandemic has been negative in so many ways across the board societally, but for people with disabilities, it's also been a positive. I've been able to speak with people in London, in Argentina, in Australia. It's just been phenomenal. And even presentations like this, it's been things, and it's been very effective. So there have been a lot of positives. And the other thing to point out is that many of these platforms, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, at the onset of the pandemic were kind of niche tools that weren't used by a lot of organizations or brands. But of course, we've all had to use them. And because of that, people with disabilities have raised their hand and said, hey, certain features are not accessible for us. And a lot of the, if not all of the platforms have really advanced accessibility. So it's just been phenomenal to help a lot of people with disabilities.
Great. Thank you. Okay, any other questions? It's your last chance to ask them. Oh, Jenny has a question in the chat. So first, she says thank you. And her question is, why aren't companies adding captions to their ads?
Yeah, that's a good question. And some companies are. Degree is one, Google's one. And some of them aren't adding captions to their ads. A lot of them aren't adding captions to the ads because they just don't recognize the need for it. And I disappointingly have to say it gets forgotten. And so that's where, in that diagram where you saw the various steps within the creative process, oftentimes brands don't think about disability inclusion until after the fact, as opposed to more upstream when, at the creative brief stage or even at the creative team stage. And if it's brought up at that level, hopefully brands recognize not only the need to ensure disability from a story perspective, but also from an accessibility perspective, so that as you move further down that path of creative production, by the time it hits that post-production editor and they're in the edit bay and they're, making final tweaks to the ad, that captioning is a part of that, and that audio descriptions are a part of that. But there are certain brands that are doing that. There are a lot that aren't, and it's an opportunity to kind of reframe. Certain brands are putting their fully accessible ads on YouTube, and others are putting them out in traditional broadcast TV, and hopefully that can increase.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions? Anything else? Doesn't look like anything else is coming through in the chat.
Maybe, I actually do have maybe one more question just to close things out. Josh, we have a number of students on right now who are either about to start their internship or gonna, graduate soon and about to enter the workforce.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any advice, one for students to, become better allies to people with disabilities at work, but then also if you have any advice for students with disabilities to, advocate for themselves as they enter the workforce.
Yeah, definitely. Sky, those are both phenomenal questions. So the first thing, just as an advertising professional, don't be afraid to talk to anybody, no matter their level. Don't feel like if you're moving into an internship, you can only talk to interns or that person you directly report to. Feel bold enough to be able to ask questions to the executive creative director, to somebody at upper level management, even the CEO. As an individual, you hopefully have passions and insights that should be welcomed by anyone. So don't ever be afraid to talk to anybody. And this kind of goes into the second part of Sky's question is, if you do have a disability, be okay talking about it. We've looked back in the past, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as somebody who's queer, somebody in the LGBTQ+ community, it might have been challenging. And I don't want to dismiss that it could still be challenging, but many years ago, it was much more significantly challenging to come out to colleagues, to peers, to your boss, and say that you're a part of that community and that you celebrate that. But we've seen that so many brands now are welcoming of that, and they have affinity groups and employee resource groups that welcome that. And so if you have a disability, it's okay. Hopefully that brand, your team wouldn't see that as a negative, but rather support you in you coming out and being able to say that, you're hard of hearing. What can we do in a meeting to make sure that you're able to connect accessibly to our conversation? So don't be afraid to be able to talk about your disability. It should not be seen as a negative by anyone.
Awesome.
And as well, so Yeah, so how can you have allyship? The one thing to share there is that just be open to the conversation and ask whomever you're working with as an intern what programs they have in place for welcoming people with disabilities and in campaigns.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Sky, great questions. Awesome. We do actually have a couple more questions. So Jenny, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Jenny. I attend Rochester Institute of Technology, one of the 9 colleges, NTID, which stands for National Institute of the Deaf. So me, myself, I identify as hard of hearing, and I actually, from like elementary school to high school, it was just mainstream, so I didn't really have caption. I didn't know until like we even have service like caption until like I arrived to like RIT. So I was just wondering, because I feel like I excel and I feel like the whole caption thing helped me, I was wondering how willing is company in the future able to provide that kind of service within like meetings or even like workforce, not maybe like within like day-to-day basis in the office, but more of like conferences or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate you sharing that information right now in your question. That's wonderful to hear about the value that captioning brings to you. And so when it comes to virtual events, when it comes to live events, we've got the Cons Lions coming up. They're virtual this year. When it comes to events, we're seeing more inclusiveness, welcoming interpreters, either virtually or in person. We're seeing captioning being incorporated. But in a meeting as well, even if it's just a simple, initial kickoff meeting for a project, hopefully your colleagues should be able to recognize and welcome disability. And it doesn't even come to the point that you should identify as having a disability. The individuals on the team should be able to work within an environment that allows everybody to easily hear them. So if it's a large boardroom or a larger room than that can incorporate many people, like for example, a large auditorium classroom, that microphones are used, right? So that either faculty can convey what they're saying to the students, or that in a brand situation, a corporate executive could be able to convey something to a larger group. So we are seeing more use of technology like microphones and like captioning, and then non-technology, just people, interpreters at different places. But again, more needs to be done. And what needs to be done are students like you in moving into your internship, sharing that positive that captions have provided you or other inclusive accessibility opportunities throughout your college career, so that if that company that you might be interning at or moving into your early professional career, if they don't know about that, that's a chance for you to be the person that doesn't just look like the new person, but rather, hey, you're bringing a differentiator to the team. You're stepping up and you're sharing something and you're teaching them.
Thank you. So Brielle has a comment in the chat. She doesn't have a question, but she'd like to thank you, Josh, for the informative, in-depth presentation. As a legally blind individual, this is such an important topic that she's also passionate about, and she loved all the points that you made. So thanks again. We do have one last question from Rimsha in the chat. Are there any resources that can help us educate ourselves on how to be more inclusive in our roles in advertising?
Yeah, definitely. There are wonderful opportunities. And I think Microsoft is one of the best brands that welcomes inclusivity. And it's not just from the standpoint of them incorporating inclusive story arcs into their ad campaigns or creating accessibility into their digital programs, right? That you can easily check to see if a Microsoft Word document is accessible or a PowerPoint presentation is accessible. Microsoft provides training, and I'm happy I can share a link with Sky and Sarah after this to provide to everybody. But Microsoft has easy to follow opportunities to be more inclusive as an individual, regardless of whether you work at Microsoft or not, to understand accessibility and to move into accessibility. And from an advertising standpoint, really, there isn't too much out there. My goal is to help reframe that and to bring in more conversations, including at the student level. In particular, one of the first advertising courses dedicated to disability and accessibility inclusion in advertising. And I'd be happy to share that with AEF once I complete that at the end of this summer. But I'm always up for a conversation as well. And that's something to be able to, hopefully Sarah and Sky can share, is my email. You know, conversations can happen now, but they're going to end in just a few minutes. But I'm always more than happy to jump on a call, a Zoom meeting, or continue conversations via email to hopefully guide everyone to be more inclusive and accessible.
That's great. Thank you so much, Josh. It's very generous for you to offer that. So I think we are about to wrap up now. There are no more questions in the chat. So, you know, another huge thanks to you for your terrific presentation. We're really so lucky to hear from an industry leader, a subject matter expert, and advocate like you. And I do hope that everyone enjoyed it. We did record today's session, and we will be posting it to our website next week in case you want to rewatch it or share it with your friends. I'd also like to mention that we're partnering with the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the IAB, this summer. So instead of our usual Made web series these next 2 weeks, we'd actually like to invite you all to attend the IAB New Fronts and Podcast Upfronts events starting this Monday and running through 5/13. So that's May 13th. These events are usually invite only to people who are in the industry, in media, but they're actually opening them up to students this year. So if you're interested in the world of new media, content, digital advertising, all that good stuff, I strongly encourage you to attend. The links to those events are on our Made Online page. So that is it. Thank you all for tuning in, and please enjoy your weekend. Thanks, everyone.